Hello, my name is Mara Linsky-Deegan, and I am the Associate Registrar and Curator here at the Charles H. McNider Art Museum in Mason City, Iowa. And today we're going to talk just a little bit about the artist Shelby Ratliff. Shelby Ratliff was born in Hannibal, Missouri in 1902, and in 1923 he met and married his wife Pauline. And then in 1924, the couple moved from Missouri into Humboldt, Iowa. So in the 1920s, right up until the very early 1930s, Shelby Ratliff was a kind of a construction worker. What he did was he built what they call high lines, which are really, really tall electrical lines like you see out when you're driving along the highway, really, really high ones. And he would go up and build those so that people could have electricity all over the Midwest. He worked in Iowa for an Iowa utility, but then he also traveled to both North and South Dakota and Montana to do this kind of construction. So he went on like this, was able to support his family just fine until the very early 1930s. Now, some of you may know that in the 1930s, the United States and a lot of the world was going through something called the Great Depression. It means a lot of people were out of work, and it was really hard to find a job, and so a lot of people didn't have extra money for things that we sometimes think of as necessities, including electricity. It was hard for businesses and companies that created the high line so that the electricity could flow. It was hard for them to have the money to keep paying their workers. So in 1931, Shelby Ratliff stopped working for the public utilities and decided that he wanted to become a dairy farmer. So he and his wife settled, they were already settled in Humboldt, Iowa, and decided to buy a herd of cattle. They did. And he became a somewhat dairy farmer. But what the big main thing he did to really support his family was that he started working as a meat inspector at a plant in Mason City. From 1935 until 1962, he worked again as a meat inspector for the federal government. So in the mid-1960s, he retired from his job. He had a good life with his wife, and he was retired, and one day while he was sitting in his yard watching the birds, he loved to do that, just watching the birds swoop around and go in and out of the pastures and things, he decided, you know what, I'm going to try to draw those birds. So he got some paper and pens and started to make some little preliminary sketches, just basic sketches of the birds, and they turned out actually really nicely. And he was kind of fascinated with that, so he started really doing that a lot. And his wife was encouraged, he was interested in art, and so the following Christmas, his wife bought him some paintbrushes and a paint set and said, why don't you start painting those birds? So he did. So Ratliff decided that he loved to draw, loved to paint, but he wasn't really interested in taking any art classes. He kind of wanted to do this himself. So he did get a lot of books about art and learning about art and painting, and he used those to teach himself how to paint and how to create works that he enjoyed. Now, in just a minute here, we're going to kind of zoom in on the piece itself. And I want you, when we kind of zoom in, I want you to look at the piece and see what you think looks a little bit different from other paintings and drawings that you've seen. So while you're looking at the piece, I want you to listen to a quote that Shelby Ratliff said about his painting. He said, "I have never been to a painting class, and I have always had a strange feeling that I could never paint anything if anybody was watching me." I wonder, do you ever have the feeling that it's hard to maybe draw or paint if somebody's watching what you're doing? I think that would be hard for me as well. I do like, if I'm going to draw, I like to just do it myself and then show everybody at the end what it looks like and not have somebody watch me through it, but everybody's different that way. But when you were looking at the piece up close there just a moment ago, you might have noticed some things that are a little bit different than a lot of other paintings and drawings we have here at the museum. You can see here, right in the front, there's a chair. If you really look at that chair, you can notice that it looks just a little bit odd. And the reason is he used some different perspectives when he was creating this piece. Now, perspective, if you think about it, is like if you were to stand in the middle of a road and look down the road, you can see that the road gets smaller and smaller, and so it almost looks like it touches. Now we know that the road actually doesn't touch itself, that it keeps going straight, but perspective is what your eye tells you and how your eye sees things in the distance. This chair, if you look at it, it looks a little bit funky and maybe not like what an actual chair in real life would look like. So that means that the perspectives are a little bit different. And that's the same thing too with the floor and even this loom here that's in the front. It just looks a little bit different than like a photograph would. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about. And I also like to think about the fact that Shelby Ratliff taught himself how to paint and draw. So are you somebody who has taught themselves how to paint and draw? Or have you taken art classes like here at the museum? You can do that. Or at school or someplace else. So think about how you've learned to draw or paint or create on your own. And think about if there are things that you do that nobody else does. Or is there something that you do that you learned from somebody else? I also like to look at this piece and think about that Shelby Ratliff was known as an artist who used a lot of bold colors. And you can really see that here. Especially there's some yarn at the bottom here that looks like the person, whoever was looming this big giant carpet or wall hanging, was using all these different colored yarns, but you can really see them, they kind of pop. The background, I like how too they made it very textured. So it looks like what an actual room would look like, not so solid. So another thing Shelby Ratliff was really interested in was frames. Now, sometimes he created his own frames, but a lot of the times he would go to different sales and look at swap meets, and even sometimes at places where people were throwing things out, and he would find old frames and then reuse them, which I think is kind of cool. So he would maybe find a frame that would maybe look good with a piece that he created and reuse that frame. And that was a great way to get old frames reused instead of just thrown away.